if I may please get your attention. Yeah. All right. Welcome to our event, Key Principles to Save the Carbon Cycles. I'm very excited for this event. We have a really good lineup of speakers, my colleagues Samantha and Erica, and we have a really fantastic panel. And of course, Eli, thank you a lot for moderating. Before we get into it, I'll give a very quick introduction about Bellona. We're an international environmental NGO. We work on enabling solutions for the climate emergency. We're originally based in Oslo. We have an office in Brussels and, of course, in Berlin. We work on carbon dioxide removal. We're involved in the NEGAM Horizon 2020 project. We're trying to make sure that carbon dioxide removal policy is enabled in a way that is consistent with meeting our long-term climate goals. So before we get into the panel discussions, there'll be two presentations. First by my colleague Samantha, then by my colleague Erica. Samantha unfortunately can't join us, but I'll put a video that she's recorded for us.
Hello, my name is Dr. Samantha Eleanor Tanzer. I'm the Carbon Dioxide Research and Policy Manager with Bellona Europe, and I'm here today to talk about the importance of keeping separate things separate in carbon accounting. Why do we count carbon? Carbon accounting, greenhouse gas accounting, actually has a dual purpose. One is to account for the physical flows of greenhouse gases as they move between the atmosphere and other sinks, and the other is to account for the responsibility specific actors have to abate those emissions. And confusion arises when we conflate actions to discharge this climate responsibility with actions that have a physical impact on the climate. And good carbon accounting aligns climate responsibility with physical climate science. There are two sides to carbon accounting. The first is measurement of carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas emissions, which is how much greenhouse gases are being physically emitted to the atmosphere. And that physical measurement is typically also the measurement of responsibility an actor has to reduce those emissions. And the hard part really is deciding who is responsible and for what emissions. But that's not what I'm going to talk about today. So we have our responsibility to act, which is how much physical greenhouse gases are entering the atmosphere. The second side is action. There are three distinct types of climate action. The first is emission avoidance, so emitting less greenhouse gases than in an alternate scenario. The second is emission reduction, emitting less greenhouse gases than you did in the past. And the third is carbon dioxide removal, so physically extracting and permanently storing carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. These three types of actions result in three different types of claims you can make about discharging your climate responsibility. CO2 avoidance is saying that I'm not increasing the atmospheric greenhouse gases as much as I could have. Reductions is saying I am doing it less quickly than I did before. And removal is a physical decrease in atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations. And in practice, it needs to be a decrease in atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations. These three types of actions actually have three different units of measurement. They all might seem like they're measured in tons of CO2 or tons of CO2 equivalent, but avoidance measures an assumption in terms of tons of carbon dioxide that were assumed to have been avoided than if you had made a different choice of action. CO2 reduction measures a change in tons of CO2 less than a historical baseline. And CO2 removal measures the physical flow of CO2 being removed from the atmosphere minus the tons of CO2 or CO2 equivalent of associated emissions. Only one of these actually measures a physical flow that's going on. Avoidance and reductions are actually non-emissions. They're zeros that we use to indicate how much of our responsibility we have discharged, but it's only removals that measure physical flows of extractions along with their associated emissions. And reduction and avoidance, not emitting greenhouse gases, is the fundamental bedrock of preventing catastrophic climate change. This is particularly because carbon dioxide removals are resource intensive, and there are still many uncertainties, and there will be limits to how much they could be effectively developed and deployed. Rapidly and maximally reducing existing emissions and avoiding new ones is the only way to ensure that the removals that will be available can balance remaining emissions to achieve or surpass net zero. Therefore, it is important that we keep separate targets for reductions and removals to avoid the issue of removals distracting from the urgent necessity of aggressive emission reduction. So, I'm actually going to talk about one other thing today, which is how do we measure carbon dioxide removal in particular? So, carbon dioxide removal is the permanent and net removal of greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. So you have to physically take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, you have to store it somewhere, you have to account for all emissions in the associated supply chains, and the number we really care about is net carbon dioxide removal. So the amount of removal that's removed and stored minus those associated emissions. And when I mean all emissions, I really do mean all of them. Like, accounting for carbon dioxide must take a life cycle approach that accounts for all emissions associated with a CDR option and implementation, no matter where or when they occur. It is only this net carbon dioxide removal which measures the decrease in atmospheric greenhouse gases, which is the goal of carbon dioxide removal, and it is only physical flows of greenhouse gases that can be included in this net CDR, because as we discussed just now, avoidance and reduction should always be counted separately. And what do I mean when I say it has to be permanently removed from the atmosphere? So carbon dioxide, when emitted, stays in the atmosphere for hundreds to thousands of years. And permanent storage means keeping it out of the atmosphere for at least that long. Geological storage can do that, just as it kept fossil fuels in the ground for thousands of years, with minimal risk of leakage. Biological storage, such as in biomass stocks, can also keep carbon out of the atmosphere for long periods of time, but requires ongoing maintenance and liability to prevent and remediate potential reversals that might happen from wildfires, drought, pests, or mismanagement. And just as avoidance and removals are fundamentally distinct, so are removals that store carbon in geological and biological sinks. They have differences of available scale, differences of expected permanence, differences of risk of reversal, and monitoring needs that require separate accounting. So, just to sum up, you need to put different things in different buckets. They all need to be counted for, but they shouldn't be added together. Avoidance, reductions, and removal should be accounted separately because they're not the same thing. This means we should set targets for reductions and removal separately because they're not the same thing. And biologic and geologic storage of CO2 needs also to be accounted for separately, especially in carbon dioxide removal accounting, because they're not the same thing. Thank you for your time. Erica will be following up with some policy recommendations, especially related to the importance of these separate targets and separate things. Thank you. Thank you for your time. If you have any questions for me, please let my colleague Mark know, and he'll make sure that I get them. Have a great time. Bye-bye.
Great, thank you very much. Now we'll move on to Erica. Hold it next to your chair.
Hi, and thank you so much for coming. Samantha just kind of set the stage by making this fully scientific argument for why removals are not reductions, and you have to keep it separate. So, and this is what we have thought about from the German context. If this is what the science is telling you, well, what could actually the regulation look like? How can you create a governance which addresses that point? As you may know, in Germany we have one of the governance instruments is the Klimaschutzgesetz, so the Climate Act, and it does have emission reduction targets. And we have asked Becker Büchner Held, which is a law firm in Berlin, which is very much dealing with energy and climate issues, to give us some more insights of whether or not it is feasible to introduce separate reduction and removal targets into the German Climate Act. And we just recently, last week Friday, actually published this short legal assessment on the topic. And what does the title mean, translated into German? It means status and a new approach towards a provident regulatory framework on negative emissions. So what do we want to be provident about? Just briefly 2 slides, because actually Samantha already explained the problem. We want to be provident of the fact how removals could cannibalize reductions and vice versa. So we are all already in an overshoot scenario. The question is, how bad is it going to get? Is it going to be like more like here, where there are just unbelievably high negative emissions amounts that IPCC is planning for the future? Or is it going to be more like this? So as also my colleague Samantha explained, the actual removal is actually an inefficiency. It consumes a lot of resources. So we probably don't want that. And we certainly don't want to give us to our children and their children, because this would happen, after our time. What we want to do is to take our responsibility for quick emissions reductions that are not cannibalized by removals, and actually minimize future need for negative emissions. So we get more into this area. At the same time, we already know negative emissions are absolute necessity, and to some extent they will definitely be needed for effective climate change. So in parallel to ensuring emissions reductions, we actually need incentivization of negative emissions. Another point, permanence. There are very different types of negative emissions. Some of them, the carbon doesn't get stored for very long, only like maybe a decade or 2, which on a climate scale is basically not relevant, right? Because it gets emitted. And there are other which are geological timescales. And as one would guess, the ones that are, high quality removals with geological timescale permanence are the ones that are very expensive, and the ones that are not going to just happen like this and by a market-driven situation. So somehow there needs to be regulatory, support for getting those deployed. So this was kind of the background of the situation. How are we going to address that? We discussed with Becker Büchner Held the possibility of actually having 3 targets. An emissions reduction target, which is separate from a technical negative emissions target, which is separate from a natural things target. Could a system of 3 targets be incorporated into the German Climate Act? Then the lawyers got to that, and how do lawyers work? Question number 1, what is it? So they investigated the definitions. Then the question to ask in legal terms is there actually an obligation to put it into law? There may or may not be. if you are not obligated, but you still find a reason to do that, is there actually a possibility? And last but not least, what form could the incorporation take? And the BBH did some nice, solid work on that, where they first went through lots of definitions. And in fact, there are lots of definitions, which also means that there is no definition in legal sense. In particular, when you move to technical CDR and you leave the LULUCF sector, there's very little determination, and there's actually not a solid definition that could be like satisfying a lawyer. In the legal assessment, one of the things they did, they actually proposed a definition based on an IPCC definition, and really defined it in that it's a specific amount that has to be taken out of the atmosphere, that it has to be a full life cycle perspective. So you take something out of the atmosphere, but you also use energy, or you emit CO2 while doing so. So this needs to be subtracted. So it's kind of like a net amount that you remove. And finally, that also permanence is addressed. Then the next question to the lawyers is there an obligation to incorporate? The short answer is no. There's no obligation to incorporate. The long answer is on the lawyer's slide or in our full assessment that I would like to invite you to go to the Bellona Germany website and download for yourselves. They actually worked through international law, EU law, national law, and what they find, there's no obligation. There's no comprehensive framework for CDR. Certain aspects are defined in certain frameworks like CCS or LULUCF, but basically there's no, it's actually a regulation gap on especially technical CDR. Right? Nevertheless, it is possible to close that gap. And in fact, they have developed a specific suggestion how you add one paragraph to the German climate law that will actually address that gap, that there's no technical emission target. And what they also found in this process is that actually also the natural things target is weakened because it has kind of like the wrong wording. It is not phrased as a mandatory target, but as a should maybe do target, with the word of the German word soll instead of werden, and this like makes a world of difference. Actually, the emission reduction is mandatory. The negative emission target is like essentially non-existent because even the LULUCF target is not mandatory, and the technical target doesn't exist. So the suggested change is, to change it and to introduce 3 targets, all of them as mandatory, and to guard against cannibalization by making sure that those targets are actually separate next to each other, and there is no provision that one can be counted against another. Where does it get us? It seems like a technical legal issue, but it's actually opens up the whole mechanism of the climate law regulatory mechanics. Because you have a set target, you have a target year, you have a mandatory target, you have a responsible ministry, which is then also obligated to come up with measures and to come up with additional measures if targets are missed, which has a monitoring process, and which can also be then in line with the EU laws and regulations. So coming out of, well, we basically don't have a definition and we don't have a framework, it would actually initiate a certain regulatory dynamic that you have targets and then you can have other regulations derived from it which gear towards implementation. I guess I just already started talking about the slide and told you the advantages of actually doing that. There are, of course, some open questions still. The proposal works well for DAX, but it doesn't work well for BECS because actually biomass is switching around between the paragraph 3A and the new paragraph 3B, and it doesn't want to be in one or the other, and it's kind of like breaking that firewall concept. And it could be, but I'm sure if we commissioned a second study, they would find a way, lawyers would find a way to solve that. And the other question which jumps out is how to finance. If we are strict about the separation of reduction and removal, so we have firewall it, we don't calculate one against the other, we can also not sell removals into the emissions reductions. However, I will not talk about it today, but in the legal assessment, most of it actually is suggesting a support scheme. So I am showing the time and I am done. Thank you very much for listening to this. Please download the full assessment and come back to me with questions. This is only a first step. This is a starting point. There are still open questions. There are a lot of open questions, but we hope that we can start this discussion now and eventually get to a robust, solid governance system on negative emissions.
Thank you so much, and I'll introduce myself in a minute, but while I'm doing so, if we could invite the panelists to come up and take their seats. Thank you so much. So I'm Eli Mitchell-Larsen. I'm the Chief Science and Advocacy Officer and co-founder at Carbon Gap. We are a relatively new ENGO focused on scaling safe, effective, and just carbon removal in Europe. And we're so pleased and grateful that Bellona has convened this excellent event with such esteemed panelists. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Oliver Gieden. He's Senior Fellow at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, and also the lead author for the IPCC Working Group 3 report, which was so influential this year in finally giving us clarity on what is a removal. Erica Bellman, you've already heard from, and we're so pleased that she has this example that we can actually react to shortly. Head of Bellona Deutschland. Olga Gasanzada is a senior advisor at Carbon Limits in Oslo, but she's also a member of the 24-member supervisory board for Article 6.4, which is, of course, the mechanism by which we will hopefully soon agree how can countries trade removals and emission reductions among themselves. And finally, Vila Ninista, member of the European Parliament for the European Greens, and already a very key figure in helping us shape how sustainable carbon cycles will evolve in Europe. So first, I wanted to get the three panelists to my right to react to Erica's presentation briefly, as well to what Samantha said. The question being, how can we incorporate those key concepts into the supranational level, the international level, and through the scientific community? And as well, if you'd like to give a brief opening statement about your priorities as well, please do so. Check, yeah.
Am I the first one by virtue of sitting next to you? Okay, good. You've done this to me before. Good day, everyone. My name is Olga Gasanzada, and as Ali mentioned, I work for Carbon Limits, Norwegian consulting company, but I am also a member of the supervisory body for Article 6.4 under the Paris Agreement, which is charged with governing the cooperative mechanisms under the Paris Agreement, specifically Article 6.4. I'm here representing my personal views on the board, on the body, not the body itself. I think reflecting on what Eric has been mentioning, it's interesting how you highlighted the difficulty the lawyers had with the definition. This is difficulty that some might have noticed we have had as well in the body. They know how much time the lawyers have spent. We had a few meetings and some, and some reports to read through. And of course, it is something that's very difficult. But I think if somebody has been following our work, our task has been our understanding of the task. I understood the task. That we are providing framework guidance at this point. And we had to be broad, so we don't exclude things prematurely, things that we, for example, have no understanding of. I think it's also very interesting on how you reflected on the differences in permanence. This is also something that in my reflection, the members of the 6.4b have struggled with. It's very hard to bring in one guidance, biological removals and engineering removals, we call them. But it's also important to reflect on the fact that it's not only sinks or reservoirs, as you call them. The carbon ends up in different things that require examination. So this would be my short comments on your specific presentation. If there may be more questions or feedback, from people in the room specifically on what, on the text that we have recommended to CMA and has been returned to us, and what happened there. I'm quite happy to offer my reflections on that, and I will pass on to the next speaker.
Yeah, thank you very much. I like the proposal very much because it shows in which kind of nitty-gritty question you get yourselves into, and also where you run into trouble when you try to come up with clear concept within existing law. And I think there is some trouble here, and just to spice it up, I will now only say what I criticize. What I don't understand about Bellona's position, and many NGOs saying we need to distinguish between removals and emissions. But we never do that, or the NGOs never do that for LULUCF. It's a net target, we have it on the EU level, and you would need to distinguish it there as well. You have the famous 225 on the EU level. I'm an EU energy and climate policy expert. Now you have the 310 in the LULUCF regulation, but it's gross emissions and gross removals. That will even be more important on a global level, because all the IPCC time series you see, and Erica showed net land use change emissions time series, because NSA 1.5, there wasn't anything else. It goes into net removals because deforestation goes down. So to be able to see what actually is happening, we need also to distinguish within LULUCF into gross emissions and gross removals. That might get us even into more trouble if you try to establish firewalls legally. I don't have any idea how would that, if you make that change, how it would look like. The second point is that I will be get in trouble if we take from the German law, but also from the EU climate law, already that dichotomy, technological or engineered versus ecosystem based or nature based. I'm sorry, it does not make any sense at all to me to have the distinction. The IPCC denied that distinction, but did not come up with a, let's say, with a new proposal. But I think the logical proposal, because that's the first thing people talk about when they talk about why it's important, is time scale of storage. Then why don't we just say time scale of storage? We could, of course, coming from a European regulation, say LULUCF based, non-LULUCF based. or divide via the pillars we have. That's also a possibility. But nature-based, it's also laden with meaning and sometimes problematic. But if you try to get the methods in, where would biochar end? And if you put it into one of the two sides, does the meaning you create for that bucket still hold? I'm not sure. But of course we have to deal with that. And of course it's a little bit unrealistic to say, well, let's just scrap that nature-based versus technological distinction in the EU climate law, because it's already there. But I think it will be quite hard to deal with that. So I would say permanence would be a better indicator of how to sort it out, and that's exactly what the IPCC, both working group 1 and 3, does.
Thank you. Good afternoon from my side as well. I am the Parliament's rapporteur on LULUCF, so I do know well what you're talking about, and we just had a preliminary political deal between the co-legislators last week, and I'm also going to be the green shadow on the file for carbon removal certification, which will come from the Commission within a few weeks. There will most likely be some other party that takes the rapporteurship, but I will work on that file as well. I think that the issues you're touching upon are crucial in our understanding of how we can address the climate change, but already this discussion shows that we don't yet have final answers on how to do the divisions, how to actually make sure that our regulations are not full of loopholes, full of greenwashing, full of double counting, and these kind of issues that have insofar made it difficult to achieve our climate targets. I think it's key to understand also, if I could look from the LULUCF context, that in that context, when we are thinking about carbon sinks in the natural world, we are very closely linked to biodiversity issues. So it's about forests, about restoration of peatlands, wetlands, nature. We have the COP on biodiversity coming 1 month from now, and we need to address these challenges together, the loss of biodiversity and climate action. So it's not mainly about biological removals as offsetting, it's about biological removals as a way of restoring natural world and addressing the different environmental challenges we have. So therefore I think also in carbon farming and how we farm, I mean, carbon farming practices mean deep-rooted vegetation, winter vegetation, less nutrient loss to waters and seas, and therefore better quality of water as well, and less need for fertilizers. So it's about circular economy, biodiversity, and climate action when we do LULUCF regulation. So we should mainly be very clear about LULUCF being increased sinks in the natural world, with linkages to these other important issues like biodiversity. So how we use land must be more sustainable. Then if we do kind of like removals or offsetting, it should be additional to that goal that we set to the governments when it comes to respecting biodiversity. And we from the Parliament side actually pushed for Article 6 being interpreted in EU context in LULUCF already by excluding private offsetting schemes from the government's goals. So any privately funded offsetting or compensation scheme should be then counted separately from this public target for member states. That would be a way of starting to address this issue, but the member states didn't want that. So we postponed, we kicked the can forward, so there will be a separate discussion based on a Commission proposal on this. But I think this just shows how complex it is. We don't want to double count things. If we want to incentivize the private sector to channel money to these things, they should not first be at the cost of emission reductions, and they should be additional to what we already oblige ourselves to do. So these are the preconditions we should have in place, and we don't yet have that clarity. And when we come to this carbon removal certification then that the Commission comes forward with it in a few weeks, it's going to be super interesting, but also super vague at this point. So we need discussions like this, because insofar it's just voluntary rules for trying to clarify timelines and permanence of storage, and trying to define how different ways of storages and removals work, but we don't yet know where this voluntary certification would be applied. So that's a big problem, I mean, and I think what we need to re-emphasize, which I think your basic approach here is that emission reductions come first. So we should not look at the future where hotel chains say that, oh, we just do offsetting instead of putting solar panels on top of the hotel because it's cheaper to do offsetting. Then there's something wrong in the calculus, because it should be cheaper to install solar panels and get rid of fossil fuels in the chain's use of energy, and it would be beneficial for us as a whole. So we have to make sure the regulation supports emission reductions, support of the natural world, also the broader context than just sinks. Restoration is included there as well. And these are kind of low-hanging fruits. Restoration should be done anyway. And then thirdly, try to find and define rules on what role technological solutions can have and different storage solutions on top of that. And we are not yet there, but this debate needs to be happening.
Erica, do you want to react to the reactions?
I'm very happy to react to the reactions. Thank you for the reactions. This is why on one of my last slides it was like the headline was, this is a first step, because exactly all of this, right? This needs to be brought out more on EU level, on international level, on national level, so we can actually get into, a good debate about those issues. I like to a little bit contradict Oliver, because I don't think that the NGOs are like not distinguishing between reductions and removals. At least Bellona always trying to do that. But the frames that are set in a lot of the debates and also in the regulatory is that you actually offset. Yeah, and Bellona is always fighting offsetting. So I see myself here also trying to, do something against offsetting. But the other things, it is absolutely true that actually it doesn't matter whether it's technical or natural. And in fact, everything that's natural, as soon as it has to be anthropogenic, so you can claim your credit, it is also technical at that same moment. And anything that technical is natural, because you cannot do technical things against the law of nature. So I totally agree that this distinction is actually now turning to be more of a problem than it is helpful. And yet, as you said, is it realistic to go away from it? It's probably not realistic to go away from it, so we are trying to find a way to work with it. Yeah. And so thanks a lot for your remarks on this. Thanks a lot of bringing yet additional aspects of LULUCF. We are also convinced at Bellona that it's actually not fair to calculate LULUCF in molecules of CO2, because the biodiversity and, forests or greenland.
No, just to clarify, I think you do not account for gross emissions under LULUCF. You have a net flux target proposed, and of course it contains gross emissions, gross removals. I'm not sure what exactly would change if you do that, but I think, sorry, it always strikes me as not consistent to always say we want to distinguish between emissions and removals and then just take the net flux of LULUCF and call that a removal target. If you think it through, we always will have land use change emissions. You would also add to your residual emissions, but you would also get a better sense what might be unavoidable there and what not, and not just try to remove your way out of your mess. And may I add another question to all, and especially to you. I find it really striking that Timmermans and others in the EU now sell the 310 million tons, going above the cap of 225 we have in the 2030 target, as additional 2 percentage points to get to a 57% NDC, which then would be the first time if we accept it like that. But I really would like to, I don't know what to make of it, but now we have a higher NDC because we do more removals. What do the panelists think of that? I really find that an interesting situation.
Well, we have done ourselves a bit of a problem already in the Paris Agreement, because we are speaking about net target and carbon neutrality, and EU's target for 2050 is carbon neutrality as well. So that includes the net amount. So then we start to count in LULUCF, and this is a bit problematic because EU's emission reduction target is actually 52.8. Then we do on top of that land use action, which we count as additional, but to be totally honest, our sinks have been deteriorating in the last 10 years. So we had actually 310 millions of tons of sinks around 2012, 2013. So we are going back to that level, and we call it a net target of 57%. So it's not super honest. I agree with that, but that's how it's counted. We have to be transparent about that. This net target is counted from a base number of a very low level of sinks, which we haven't been above historically in many time periods. But at the same time, that doesn't take away the importance of increasing sinks, because a lot of the sink actions we are doing is trying to address negative trends of our land use, which needs to be solved anyway as part of the climate challenge, like how much deforestation is a cause of how we produce food, and how much agriculture is a cause of emissions. And Parliament tried to address this problem of net accounting in LULUCF by introducing separate sub-targets for different sectors of land use. That was not yet agreed by the Council, so we are looking still to future discussions on that. But I think this LULUCF needs to be very clear. Emission reductions should be very clear, and then we do on top of that what you are talking about here. So we should make sure that it's additional when it comes to technological removals, or even biological removals that are carbon storages, which are not, stored carbon in growing trees and soil. If we speak about products that are carbon storage, it should be also very clearly defined that this is a separate entity. The LULUCF allows for such accounting to happen. The Commission wants to increase that, but we need to scrutinize it very well, and it needs to be science-based.
Excellent. One of the easiest jobs moderating I've ever had. This conversation's just flowing naturally. I wanted to say, with the last 15 minutes that we have, as Vila alluded to, this is complicated. We won't have all the answers in this panel. So I want to frame this in terms of what are the questions that we can take away, and Bellona and Carbon Gap and others can help try to distill that. I think particularly in the case of Vila with the CRCF proposal coming, and Olga with your role on the supervisory board, there's kind of a possibility for a call to action. You're going to need input, I think, particularly in the case of the 6.4 supervisory board, which needs that input from other stakeholders. Can you share a bit about kind of looking forward? What do you think stakeholders who are watching the recording, who are in the room now, what should they be doing in the coming months to help infuse some of these principles, which we mostly agree on? I think there's some small points of disagreement, but clearly we're starting to come to a consensus. On a very practical level, how do people, for example, provide input, and what should they do into a process that I think many find or mistakenly believe is a bit opaque?
Thank you very much, Ellie. I think, the majority of the discussion, has been European. But what we do affects not just Europe, it affects developing countries as well. It affects action on removals in any country, because once supervisory body adopts, for example, methodological guidance and starts adopting methodologies, these tend to become standard. We have had this experience with CDM, for example, and 6.4 is a direct successor of CDM. For the removal community, we already had a call for inputs, for example. And I have personally compared the level of input received to the European input sort of stakeholder consultation on removals and removal certification, and what we have received, and we have received maybe about 10% of the level of input, although I think our impact would be, potentially much broader internationally, than that of the European consultation. So please pay attention to what we do. It's possible to provide inputs. It's possible to follow our discussions. There's a meeting report every time, and for every meeting you can provide inputs. For every meeting there's a predetermined period of time when you can just send in your inputs towards every meeting. The agenda of the meeting is announced ahead of time. But it's also, I think, to make it more specific, I think the removal community needs to see the removals internationally and in the context of Article 6.4 also as part of the general guidance. There's methodological guidance that is being discussed that will be applicable to everything, including projects on removals, projects on the biological removals, engineering removals, and whatever other removals that you can think of. Some of the ideas that are being discussed would make the more expensive removal projects difficult to disseminate in the developing world, for example. And the question whether this is something that the international community wants to achieve or not, and we would welcome contributions from the stakeholders and what are your views on this. What is important. There's been a lot of also, I think, misunderstanding of what we've been doing, and we are very, very eager to engage with the stakeholders to explain and to interact. There's open sessions with stakeholders. It's a bit hard to follow us because they keep changing sometimes the time, so we have very, very long days. But at the same time, it's possible to maybe send in your questions and we will respond to them online to try to clarify, what we're doing. So please interact with us and approach also the members. We're all very open to interact with the stakeholders. Thank you.
Thank you, Olga. And maybe turning to the carbon removal certification framework, which is, of course, this potentially very influential, also in an international sense, framework for actually certifying what is a high-quality removal in the European Union. I think I wanted to talk about geological net zero, or this idea that we separate the short-term carbon cycle and the long-term carbon cycle. But I think there's so much agreement on that point that I want to jump to something that Vila alluded to, which is this question of why are we removing carbon? Sometimes we're removing carbon to make a compensation claim against fossil fuel emissions. Other times, perhaps the primary purpose is biodiversity enhancement, ecosystem restoration. So I wondered if, beginning with you, but please other panelists react as well, we can talk about this question of what is the use of a certified removal? If we know a removal has taken place, we've certified it under the CRCF, for example, what does its use imply about the way in which we measure it, the way in which we incentivize it, and the money we use? And please feel free to make this specific to the proposal which is coming, but which we've seen some previews of what it may contain.
Well, I think at this stage it's really unclear where the Commission even wants to implement the regulation or the certification, but we can play with ideas. I mean, if we have a carbon removal certification, the minimum idea is to try to define that everything is transparent, that there is a project and it's transparently known how long it stores, what it stores, where it stores, and what are the risks related to it. And the question after that is that if this is defined, then where it can be used. One obvious thing is that even within the existing emission reduction targets or LULUCF targets, it is useful to have some kind of a guidance on knowing what are best practices when we do nature restoration. That is a low-hanging fruit. If we do wetlands and peatlands restoration, we will have an understanding of what are good things to do and what needs to be taken into account. So that's the biological part of it. And I think we should start with that because there are the obvious biological gains. But when it comes to technological storage and reserves, obviously the timescales are long. So that is one benefit if we can make sure that we do know that the technology delivers what it promises. Insofar in the pilots we've had for such solutions, it shows that the pilots have not delivered on their promises yet. So this is one thing as well. We have to make sure that the project does what it is certified to do. But what that can be used to? I don't think we have clear answers yet. I think on the biological side, it's clear that we can take aspects of it into how we, for example, channel public money. When it comes to the CAP, the Common Agricultural Policy of the EU, we can support in eco schemes best certified practices on how that can support also climate action. But on the technological research side, precisely what you're also saying, that this should not be at the cost of emission reductions. How to solve that issue, how that additionality then can be verified, and who pays for it. That's an open question which I don't think the Commission has an answer yet. So we are on the starting point of our development.
Excellent. And I think we've alluded to the fact that there are different ways of dividing up removals. I think Oliver has often advocated that we look at the character of the carbon storage, the site where it's stored and the physical characteristics of that storage. Of course, the Commission is proposing that we divide things in terms of carbon farming, which roughly maps onto nature-based solutions, industrial solutions, and then a third component about the built environment and products. So we also see in the sustainable carbon cycles a lot of discussion about the bioeconomy and circularity. I have a feeling, to try to introduce some potential controversy to the panel, there might be different views on the role of long-lived products and elements in the built environment. Can we talk about some of the principles and questions that we want to take forward from this conversation to make sure that, to the extent those activities are incentivized in Europe and beyond, that the climate benefit they're delivering is real? Maybe, yes.
There's certainly, again, a lot of complexity in this question, but at the same time, we can also reduce complexity again to the permanence. And storage and products and built environment, it will again be a question of permanence, like how long-lived are those products, how repairable are they, how reusable are they, how recyclable are they, and what happens then at the end when they are no longer recyclable. Are they then just what, landfilled, burnt in a thermal treatment plant? Is a thermal treatment plant then obliged to have carbon capture in order to continue the storage process? Those are, in fact, open questions, and I would also hope that the Commission really thinks about it, because there's a big danger by having short-lived products which are then also not recyclable, and where the end of life is not addressed sufficiently in the methodology, that we actually have emissions and we count them as removals. And that would be a big concern, I think, from Bellona's side.
Yeah, to add on that, I think one big concern is that traditional sectors just see the removal certification or any policy making in that direction as a source of new revenue inflow. I also think that DG Klima uses carbon farming in the way they define it. I mean, funnily, they even have forestry under that label. It's not only agriculture, that's the extension of it. It's to create new revenue streams into the common agricultural policy as a next attempt to green it. At the same time, if you would look, let's say, at the EP's Agri Committee, yeah, well, how look they at that? Products is the same. I think we need to build a solid pipeline that prioritizes, because to solve all these questions that Erika raised, for products, you would need a huge bureaucracy to follow that carbon through the cycle, and for which gains. So theoretically, long-term storage under a certain threshold would happen there, but I think it's just not a priority, even if sectors will call for it. And I think we need that kind of priority. What are the kinds of removals we need to take care of now? And again, that would be long-term, probably geological storage, but also easy to monitor, to verify, to report. Because, I mean, you don't want to, it's so easy if you just don't emit, a ton of CO2, you know it's not emitted. If you remove a ton of CO2, you have to follow that ton of CO2 for a long time. And then if you compare methods with regard to that criteria, then you also can say, okay, maybe some methods create less of an administrative burden in doing the MOB, and I think that should be an important factor.
Maybe I will add quickly because 6.4 SB is the one who received most criticism, I think, for including products in our definition. And I want to say that we have actually used the IPCC definition of oceanic reservoirs, biological reservoirs, geological reservoirs, and products. And the reason we have examined it actually, and the reason why we continue to use products is because not everything can become part of reservoir. Really not everything, and even things that are very, very durable might not become part of reservoir, and if they're not part of reservoir, what they are is a product. An example that I can, for example, use is biochar from wastewater sludge that can be potentially toxic, and you might not want to reintegrate it with a biological reservoir, but if you remove it, it is in the end a product. They can be stored for a very, very long time. And we, as SB, for example, we at the 4 meetings that we've had, well, 3 actually, we have not had an opportunity to examine, whether this is something to be included or to be excluded. Permanence is a hill we're yet to climb, and we will climb it at one point, but not to the point where we are examining a definition. So please be understanding that when we discuss a language, it's a language that needs to be encompassing of the possibilities that we will examine at a future date.
Yeah, I forgot to mention the carbon storage product in this context, and I would just like to add shortly that I think it's also important to realize that we don't need to find ways of getting discounts for things that are better than fossil fuels all over the place, because if we get a proper price for carbon and emissions, then fossil fuels will be more expensive and products based on those like plastic, and then wooden-based products will be relatively cheaper. So you don't have to get a double discount for the same thing. It's already included also in EU ETS is included the cost of using fossil fuels. So sometimes I feel that those who want to have a carbon storage product discount in LULUCF accounting and also in the certification scheme might forget that there is a risk of you start to account the added benefit many times, and then that's wrong guidance. And I'm also worried that if we start to label carbon storage products as kind of like something that is stored for 1 year, it's very different to have a cardboard box, which is, we have the fine finished forests, and then we use them for cellulose. We export it to China. They make cardboard boxes, and we buy them from Alibaba. And I don't really call that carbon storage yet. It's very short term. So also there is a difference of having a wooden construction that is a carbon storage for 100 years than having something that is a carbon storage for 1 year. So that scientific base has to be really clear on when you make a claim that something is a storage. You need to know with enough definitive knowledge that how long it will be a storage.
Thank you. We're running low on time, so I'm going to give every panelist a chance to say a few more remarks, and I'm going to give a possible prompt, but feel free to take it in another direction. And that prompt is, we've been talking a lot about rule setting, Article 6.4, the Carbon Removal Certification Framework, the brilliant interventions from Samantha, as well as from Erica, on what rules should we put in place that really just set the stage for properly accounting for this stuff. But of course, we need to incentivize removals if we want them to happen. So feel free to close with whatever marks you'd like, but one idea would be, do you have a preferred or a favorite or a kind of positive example of an incentive mechanism, whether it's through the cap or through the ETS or through some other entirely different instrument that you'd like to just put as food for thought about how can we actually go beyond just setting rules, but actually start to scale up and incentivize and drive forward removals? Maybe, is it okay to start with you, Erica? Thank you.
And you want just one?
Ideally, yes.
Well, then I think that having a target for removals a target that needs to be met by government, because it's like a target in a climate law, for instance. That would open up the possibility for also providing some government support for people who are developing that type of solutions. And that could be one of the things that could make it viable commercially, at least at the beginning, to start deploying those technologies.
I think one thing is already that we need these kind of certifications and kind of like public control over what are different green claims to make sure that the private market, even without public money, then the public has an understanding of what are the consequences of different solutions. So I think when it comes to consumers, they will already start to buy carbon farming products. They will want to have food products which have a low or even negative CO2 value. So we need to make all of that transparent, the CO2 effect of a product, that it's already promoting storage solutions as well. So that is what we need to do for the private market, and not just always just trying to offset and compensate and avoid doing emission reductions. So there needs to be additional. I think that's the key thing. And the other thing is, like I said already, it's a way of channeling public money to better solutions. So when we have clear rules on what is being sustainable or transparently storage, we know how long it is, then it's also a tool for channeling public money to better causes.
Well, on the incentive side, you can think of basically everything we already have in emissions reductions. I'm not going to list them all. I think what's more important at that point in terms of governance is to create responsibilities, not make removal something where you get as a pool of offsetting. But if you are in a sector that is hard to transition, then create responsibilities that this sector comes up with carbon removal solutions within the sector. Then it's just counterbalancing, it's not really offsetting. You still might think, okay, but they could just have reduced the emissions, but keep the responsibilities in the hard to transition sectors.
Well, of course, Article 6.4 is an international offsetting mechanism. But in this, I think in this community, it's very common to see offsetting as something negative, as transfer of emission responsibility to somebody else. If you come from a country that potentially hosts projects, it's a subsidy. It's a mechanism to to distribute technologies, to distribute solutions, to make them more accessible. I personally come from Ukraine, and I participated in a report that estimated rebuilding Ukraine, rebuilding the housing stock that has been lost as a result of Russian invasion of Ukraine, will result in emissions of 40 million tons of CO2 equivalent. That's just rebuilding cement. That's the cement and steel it will take to rebuild. And if we, for example, introduce solutions on how we incorporate carbon removals into the building, in the built environment, in subsidizing that built environment, it's offsetting something else, I'm not sure, whatever it is, the mechanism that will be there, it will be emissions avoided, it will be carbon dioxide removed, it will benefit the spread of the new construction approaches. So to me personally, it's not just the transfer of emission responsibility, but it's also the proliferation of approaches and making of emission reduction approaches or removal approaches and making them more accessible, not just in developed countries, but also everywhere else.
Thank you. And before I thank Bellona and thank the panelists, I'll just make a few very brief closing remarks, and then we'll all head off. So I think one theme that's been so powerful in this panel today and with the interventions at the front is that, it is possible to have science-first principles that define what effective carbon removal and emission reduction measurement mean. And not all of the answers exist. There's still healthy and active debate, but it is possible to start from a starting point of, what physical effect does the atmosphere experience? As soon as that encounters the reality of policymaking, however, then things start to change slightly. And so I think what we need to say is, how can we work within the constructs of the divisions that the Commission might propose, or what's maybe politically necessary in the German context as well, and say, as scientists, as advocates, as people that want to see these solutions thrive, how can we find a way to get these sustainable carbon cycle principles into those different policymaking processes? I think one other thing we heard was a bit of a call to action to provide input into the forthcoming carbon removal certification framework and green claims proposals from the Commission as they enter the Parliament, to provide feedback to the Article 6.4 Supervisory Board. These institutions can feel opaque, but they need to hear from us, and they need to hear from everyone else. So please spread the word, reach out to Carbon Gap, Bellona, everyone. So with that, I'll just say thank you so much to Bellona for organizing this incredible panel, for inviting me to participate. Thank you to the panelists for their time and remarks. Have a wonderful day, and thank you.